John, tell me, let's talk a little bit about Sark. Sark did, like I said, he spent a few years out there, started as the analyst, kind of gets bumped up, I guess after, Kiffin, takes the job at Florida Atlantic. Hopefully my timelines are correct. Coaches and kind of in the playoffs and then takes over as the OC. Tell us about Sark at Bama and what you remember about that and how he was viewed during his tenure under Saban.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a fascinating thing because, he gets hired, again, he just basically shows up one day. Again, players told
Mhm.
me that like there was no big announcement, there's no big, here's Sark. He just started showing up one day, and there's Sark. Okay, so Alabama wins national semifinal against Washington, and I write about this in the book, but there were issues with how Lane Kiffin was doing things in that game, and he was having some wasn't basically locked in the way he wanted to. And so Nick Saban famously, and they framed it as basically a mutual decision, but Nick Saban essentially fires Lane Kiffin in between the semifinal and the national championship game and promotes Steve Sarkisian from being an analyst to having to be the offensive coordinator in the national championship game. And I mean, I've thought about I don't think we think about how wild that is. There's just so much wild stuff that happens in college football that we forget that Nick Saban fired his offensive coordinator in between a semifinal game and a championship game. So he bumps up Sark. They lose that game, and Lane Kiffin himself has basically said, "If I was the offensive coordinator, we were certainly questions after that game. If it was Kiffin, would they have won?" He gets promoted to offensive coordinator. He leaves about a month or two later to go to the Atlanta Falcons, and I think there were some fans who are kind of like, good riddance. He doesn't want to be here. That's fine. Well, 2 years later, he
Mhm.
gets fired by the Falcons, and Alabama hires Sark. And at the time, I don't think it was a particularly well liked hire. I think that
Hmm.
there's a lot of trust in Saban, and especially amongst the Alabama fan base. And so I don't think people were rioting about it. But there was kind of that's weird. It's interesting that he's hiring Sark after kind of flaming out in the NFL and bailing pretty fast after the last time. But I think Sark came in. He did a really good job. Obviously, they end up winning the national championship game in 2020, and one of the most dominant seasons in college football history. I mean, it's a little tainted just because of COVID that year, and we might not remember it that way. But that was an absolutely dominant Alabama team, and Sark
Mhm.
was leading the offense. And I think that was really the year that Sark came into his own. Nick Saban got knocked out with COVID one game, and he picked Sark to be the head coach of that game. I think that was a big moment. And I can just tell you, and I read about it in the book, Saban really liked Sark, really, really liked him. And Sark had a couple of head coaching opportunities pop up after that year, one of which Auburn wanted to interview him. I remember we wrote about it at the time that Auburn really, really liked him, really wanted to interview him. And Alabama essentially kind of interceded and was prepared to bump up Sark's salary. And as part of that conversation, they basically intimated to him that, if you're willing to stay around for a little bit, like you could be the guy to replace Saban. We like you that much, and Nick respects you
Mhm.
that much that you're willing to stay. Like this job could be yours. Of course, Texas comes along, and you can't say no to Texas, and I think everybody understood why Sark did that. But at the time, he was willing to turn down an opportunity to interview for the Auburn job because of how much he liked Saban and how much Saban liked him. And so it was a real strong partnership between those two guys.
It's interesting because I got the chance to go to SEC media days and talk to Nick Saban, and he kind of talked about the relationship that he had with Sark, and also had to talk to Sark about this also in the off season. I'm kind of curious because there seems to be a mutual admiration between them. There seems to be mutual respect, and it doesn't seem to be typical coach speak. Seems like there probably is a good relationship that's there. Is that typical for Saban with all of his assistants? Is he just lovey-dovey with all of them, or is this kind of a special, unique thing from your experience?
Well, I think there's another guy in Texas who would say that it's not all lovey-dovey between Nick Saban and his former assistants. Jimbo had some interesting comments this year, right? It's not, and I think what's interesting is, and I'll psychoanalyze Saban a little bit here. I think he truly does really like him. I think what changes for Saban is he's so uber competitive. I mean, you could say ruthlessly competitive, really, that I think the relationship starts to change when he either feels threatened or is there's more of that level of competition, right? And so I think when Saban retires, he'll look back and look at Kirby Smart, be like, this guy was my protege, right? This was the guy who followed my process as closely as anybody. And he will have so much respect and admiration for Kirby, I think, once he leaves. But right now, I mean, Saban wants to beat his ass, you know, and that's just what he wants to do. And I was talking to somebody, you know, about that championship game this last year. And because Saban was very gracious in the immediate aftermath of the game, very highly of Kirby and somebody. And it was like, yeah, Saban for probably about 12 hours was gracious. And then afterwards, he just wanted to destroy Kirby again. And that's just, I think, how he's wired. And so you could say maybe part of it is that Sark hasn't risen to that level yet where he really feels like Sark is going to take him down, where maybe that changes the relationship. But to this point, I do think that there is a lot of, you know, admiration between the two of them. And one of the things that I think people sometimes with Saban, because he's such a ruthless competitor and because he wants to win so bad, people view him as just some of the things that he does is purely just cutthroat type winning stuff. And there's obviously some truth to that. But there is this part of him, and maybe it's some Catholic guilt, whatever you want to call it, where he does try to help people who have fallen. You know, I think that's something he actually does think a lot about. And so I think for him to be able to feel like he played a role in Sark's kind of reclamation project, I do think it's something that he cares a lot about. And I think that might be in part why there's a little bit of a closer relationship there. And I think also Sark seems to show him a lot of deference, more so than some of these other guys that are competing against him, more so than Lane for sure.